Supras, Cressidas, Corollas, Tercels, and those hot 4x4s. GT41, Granville Toyota at 41st, the best known car corner in the city. Shop wise for wheels. Get a lot for your money at GT41, Granville Toyota at 41st.
The big Hitachi Wintertainment event is blowing up a real blizzard of special values. Hitachi Luminar 20 color televisions. Hitachi video recorders and video disc players. Hitachi's exciting one-touch hi-fi system and big stereo sound portables.
See and hear the complete line of Hitachi products at Matrix Sound and Color Center. Friendly service on all home entertainment products in the Lansdowne Mall, Richmond.
We do more than the others do. We do the most for you.
30 seconds.
McLean, Hunter.
This wise old shopper knows K&D has it all, besides carrying a full line of brand name furniture, TV, stereo, and appliances. K&D do not charge for delivery. I need to know I'm going to get
Wish me luck in this one, Tyler.
K&D in White Rock.
We do more than the others do.
Coming up next, Webster.
Good morning. This morning we're going to tackle the disastrous state of the forest industry through the outspoken comments after the meeting with FIR yesterday of Jack Munro, the president of the IWA. We're also going to tackle the federal minister of state in charge of the Kent Commission recommendations about what he's going to do about the newspapers in this country in the face of recommendations that they should suffer some strictures and some encouragements under the aforesaid Kent Commission. And also this morning I'm going to give you my blunt opinion on the Vogel affair and how the CBC totally and absolutely and blunderingly mishandled an attempt, a pathetic attempt at investigative reporting which is going to cost you and me, the taxpayers, a minimum of $250,000, maybe $500,000, and which does serious damage to the credibility of every serious member of the press in Canada. And first, after the break, for the Vogel affair. I'm going to tell you a fairy story, but unhappily it is a true fairy story about the blundering incompetence in the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in British Columbia, which spreads from the highest level of the regional director to the lower levels of so-called investigative reporting. And to add insult to injury, because of this dreadful state of affairs, the taxpayers are going to have to put up at least $250,000 to repair malicious damage done to the reputation of a senior civil servant in British Columbia. The CBC, I might say, was playing at Watergate. It was bungling amateurism at the very least. Now, what had happened was that they had properly sniffed out a story. And after their so-called investigation, on March the 6th, 1980, they broadcast a patently damaging statement about Dick Vogel, the Deputy Attorney General, saying quite bluntly, no equivocation, no hedging, no nothing. The scales of justice up in a graphic behind, tilted and blindfolded, in which they said that Vogel had abused the power of his important office by interfering directly in 3 criminal cases to benefit 3 personal friends. They had no proof, barely a jot or tittle of proof. They had, and I'm taking this from Mr. Justice Esson's 120-page judgment, an investigative reporter by the name of Chris Bird, whom Esson described as a man of limited experience and a man who had made up more than dug up the so-called story. The CBC, to put it quite bluntly, had worked on the story for several months, and they were sucked in by what Judge Esson said was a vendetta from a senior Crown Counsel against Dick Vogel. I attended much of the trial, and I know what the evidence was. And if it weren't so serious, it was laughable. It could be described, the techniques of investigative reporting, as comic opera. In fact, if you saw it on television, you wouldn't believe it. There were clandestine meetings with a man called the Tooth Fairy. There was use of body packs, tape recorders, to body pack your enemies, but not to body pack your friends. There was cloak and dagger meetings in Stanley Parks and on boats. There was the burning of documents. There were bogus scripts to frighten people. This is what we're going to say. Now, what do you know about that? And these were bogus scripts. There were phony ambush interviews set up. The Tooth Fairy, whom I'll identify later, appeared in a phony interview. No, I can't talk about this, I can't talk about that. You know, I'm in a very important position. And that's where the Tooth Fairy comes in. Well, listen to this. After all the investigation, camera crews flying all around the province of British Columbia, the decision was made to run the story. Bird is described as cantankerous. All the people in the CBC were afraid, I think, to challenge this cantankerous reporter. And no one dared to ask what the source was and where the proof was. Now, obviously, in a patently damaging story, you're going to finish up in court. Although there's a thread that runs through this from Mr. Justice Esson, that they were so malicious against Vogel that they thought they could frighten them away from going to trial and getting any form of justice. So they had a big conference. And at this big conference, lawyers had been consulted, Eastern lawyers, because the Tooth Fairy had said, don't consult any lawyers in British Columbia or it will immediately be leaked back to the enemy, the Attorney General. They had consulted local lawyers. And at the time of making the broadcast decision, knowing that they had to have a source and proof, nobody demanded to know who the source was or who the proof was. And Director Len Locke of the CBC said at that particular conference, that particular day, Bird's superiors, I'm quoting from the judgment, contented themselves with the information and Bird's assurances that the source, when needed, would come forward to give evidence. Locke said, until then, our source is the Tooth Fairy. It's almost hard to believe. And at page 127 of the judgment, Mr. Justice Esson says, talks about Bird's conduct, and he's limited this and he's limited that. But of Bird, the judge said, had Bird's employer, that's the CBC, exercised a reasonable degree of editorial judgment and control, Bird's conduct would have caused no harm to anyone. The damage came not from the investigation, but from the publication. Then it says, the most seriously reprehensible conduct was the CBC's abdication of responsibility. In other words, nobody bothered to find out if Bird had the proof for the eventual trial which had to come. Their policy was one of blind faith in the reporter. Now, these 3 allegations, and I don't need to go over them at all in detail, involved the Riggs case, the Wendy King Farris case, and in the Moran case. And one thing that really disturbs me in this judgment is that in the long months before the trial, knowing full well, the CBC, that they had no proof in the Moran case, they arrogantly refused to make proper amends. In fact, they said, oh, don't worry, we'll prove the Moran case at the trial. Well, we're not quite so sure we'll prove the Moran case at the trial. No, we can't prove the Moran case at the trial. And here's something which must be examined by those in charge. All this time when the CBC was stubbornly insisting, because you got to wait 90 days before you sue the Crown Corporation, that they could prove their report, the CBC published a formal statement falsely implying, the CBC falsely implied, in other words, it lied, that it had investigated the facts in the light of an Attorney General's report and was in a position to prove its case against the plaintiff. Now, even if they'd had the proof, they didn't have the documents, because our great courageous investigative reporter, who must have been watching television, had burned his documents. He'd burned all the documents. And the judge, to make it clear, said that Byrd did not understand and did not care about what he or the CBC were doing to help in carrying out the personal vendetta by the Tooth Fairy against Vogel. The Tooth Fairy was Bruce Donald, a senior Crown counsel in Vancouver. He was later fired for misleading, if not actually lying, to the Attorney General of British Columbia about the leak of a certain letter at a certain time. Now, this whole Byrd-Vogel affair becomes a classic textbook primer for beginning reporters in how not to conduct yourself, how not to become an investigative reporter, and how not to be sucked in by your own skepticism or a vendetta fed to you from an apparently reliable source. Now, $250,000, you say? $125,000 damages for Vogel, 12% interest for 2 years, about $25,000 as part of Vogel's expenditures and court costs, another $150,000 for the CBC's own legal fees. There's $250,000. What does the CBC do? They're talking seriously about making an appeal. That'll cost us, the taxpayers, another $250,000. But what really, and this is where the credibility of the press is concerned, and time after time this has been hammered against myself and other old-timers in the business. You're great at slandering and damaging people, but you never, ever give them a fair crack of the whip when the case is over. When the CBC ran this phony expose, they gave it 14 minutes off the top. Oh, cleverly done. And I shuddered when I saw it, and I thought, uh-oh, big lawsuit coming. I felt sorry for the CBC at the time. But the day the judgment came down, what did the CBC do? Did they play it off the top? Did they use all the damaging stuff that I've given you from Mr. Justice Esson's judgment? Not on your life, they didn't. They ran it the 5th or 6th story. And they preceded their story with another Byrd story, 2-bit story out of Seattle or something, to endorse Byrd as still being there. And then they did a self-serving, smug, 6-minute report on this most damaging condemnation, on their own abdication of responsibility, on the fact that they were sucked in on a vendetta, and on the fact that not one single person in the CBC had dared to ask this investigative reporter who his source was, except that he was a tooth fairy in a high position. And that particular unfairness, and I don't care if it's a man who's got a criminal charge, a public official who's charged, great headlines, and in this case, when the CBC broke the story, the opposition quite naturally jumped on it, and they said, Vogel must be removed from office. Commentators said Vogel must be removed from office because, right or wrong, he has lost all his credibility. His career is ruined. Matter of fact, demands were made that the Attorney General's office in Victoria be padlocked and the administration of justice be given over to the Chief Justice of this province. That's how far the reaction went to the initial, now known to be false and malicious story created by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and I don't blame Byrd. But I love the reactions, you know. You know what CBC's like. It's doubtful even if the president of the CBC, whoever he is, will ever read this judgment or take the necessary action. Now let me tell you what the action should be. I've been in this business a long time. I've run newsrooms, I've been city editor, I've been night news editor, I've done all kinds of things. And if any reporter came to me and said, Jack, I've got a great story, magnificent, graft and corruption and personal abuse of power in the highest places, I would say, great stuff. Show me your proof. And if the reporter said to me, my witness is the tooth fairy, I'll produce him when necessary, I would say, get out my office. And if I were stupid enough to publish a story without myself knowing the proof, I deserve to be fired. And though I've known Len Locke a long time, I must say in all honesty that Mr. Locke should be removed of his responsibility for that job as regional director of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in British Columbia. Purely by happenstance, the Minister of State in charge of making recommendations on the recommendations of the Kent Commission on the monopoly powers of newspapers is here this morning. Jim Fleming, former broadcaster from Toronto, who is Minister of State in charge also of multiculturalism. It may be a highly unfair question to put to you, Mr. Fleming. You heard what I said this morning about the Vogel affair. Is this the kind of thing which perhaps made some members of the Kent Commission want to set up a press council so that when we are irresponsible, and we in the media, I'm not just talking about this one case, should be kept under some kind of government control?
You got me on two edges, Jack. I think that may be the kind of thing, irresponsibility or bad quality, not checking out
I'm
stories.
not asking you to comment on the Vogel case.
Yeah. Remember that I used to be a journalist before I was a politician. So I very strongly feel government shouldn't reach in and shouldn't be sitting over somebody's shoulder as a journalist, any more than the power of a big corporation with its clothing stores or whatever sits there intimidating the editors. But yeah, it's this kind of thing that not only ruins a reporter's reputation, but here's a national institution supposedly broadcasting the reality of the country that walks into a hole like that is pretty sad.
It is indeed. Now, about the recommendations. Yesterday, McLean Hunter announced that they're planning to buy the Toronto Sun in Edmonton, the Edmonton Sun and the Calgary Sun. And that would give McLean Hunter, which is a giant in itself, control of a radio station, a newspaper station, and a television station in Calgary. Can this be done without the government's approval?
That's a good question, and I don't finally know the answer because it seems to me the CRTC, which licenses those broadcasting and cable outlets, will have to go and look at the deal and say, now they got too much in that marketplace, and therefore, you know, people could go and control what came out of all those outlets, and therefore people in that community wouldn't get a diversity of news or information. But I do know that when they do this, after a Royal Commission makes a set of recommendations and before the government acts, that I warned them that I gave a press release last fall when somebody said they might take over Southern. Weston, somebody said, might take over Southern, although Weston's denied it. I said, listen, anybody who tries something fast between the recommendations of Kent and the government decision on what to do will reach back if you're trying to beat us.
Because in the Kent recommendations, there is a recommendation of prohibition against the enlargement of change right now, is there not?
Yeah. Well, it depends on the size of the change. You got Southern, which is largely a news industry kind of company. So I think I have more time for it in the sense that it seems to have better quality papers and so on. It's got 28% of the English language daily newspaper circulation. But Thompson's a massive conglomerate, owns the Bay, all sorts of other interests, has 21%. And for me, what would happen if Thompson bought Southern? Apparently Southern's vulnerable as Toronto Sun was vulnerable because it's expensive to run newspapers. What if they bought it and had 60% of English language daily circulation? And that's whenever you read a newspaper, you'd have that one interest there. With the board of directors, those guys with interest beyond their newspaper, primary in their mind. I think that's very dangerous.
That would be very bad indeed.
Yeah.
But what about that strange recommendation of the Kent Commission that the Globe should be sold separate away from... Who owns the Globe now? Southern? No.
No, Thompson.
Thompson.
Yeah.
The dull, grey Thompson chain has one flagship of the Globe Mail. Do you believe that Thompson should be forced to sell the Globe?
You got me on the spot, because I haven't gone to cabinet yet. All I know is we've got to make the marketplace protected from having 2 or 3 people own everything. Selling the Globe, there are a lot of problems in selling the Globe. I think a national newspaper is a good idea, and I like to have 2 or 3 of them. Don't you agree with that? You're an old newsman.
Well, we haven't got a national newspaper, really. We've got a morning edition of the Globe, which fills in a little bit. And my respect for the Vancouver Sun, since it was taken over by the boys from the East and shuffled about like a pack of cards, has gone down very sharply. I mean, if the Sun vanished tomorrow, I don't know we'll miss it that much. Maybe newspapers have lost their kind of relevancy to the whole marketplace of communication.
Yeah, but Jack, that's my problem, because it's one thing, and that's where Kent got himself, I think, in a bit of trouble. It's one thing to say we're going to go in as a parliament, we got a right, we got elected, all of us on both sides of the House, we're going to decide how to protect freedom of the press, for instance. But I think that should be freedom from government as well as freedom from these big guys, as I said earlier. So it's tough. I think the quality of a lot of the newspapers is not what it might be. And some of them are still pretty damn good. And we tend to be pretty subjective, and we don't remember how they used to be.
Right.
But I don't think we should be saying that's a good one, that's a bad one, that one should run, that one shouldn't run. We should simply set some rules in the marketplace on size and competition, so a good journalist who does a good job isn't intimidated by his boss because he's got nowhere else to go and work.
Yeah, and of course, if he's got his own tooth fairy, he's all right.
Good shape then, isn't it? For a while.
Now, what about this business? You were going to give incentives for the less profitable newspapers to spend more money on editorial content. Have you considered that recommendation?
Yeah,
yet?
I've thought about it. What I do when I go to cabinet, I've got to take them all the Kent recommendations, and then I got to say what I think we should or shouldn't do from Kent, and maybe we'll do something else in some places.
So you're Kenting the Kent?
Yeah, I'm kind of taking it and saying now it's in the political form. With Kent, it's supposedly a royal commission. Set away from that, they hear everybody, they come to conclusions. But I'm the guy that's got to go to cabinet and say, realistically, I think this is what you can and can't do.
I bet you do nothing.
I bet you're wrong.
What areas?
Concentration, conglomerate ownership, and a way of redressing the public. Those are the areas I hope.
Oh, press council, of course, where people can be called up and put through by senior civil servants.
That's a possibility, but not by senior civil servants. That would be my interest, is to see if we can find a way that you or nobody else can say the government did that or those are government guys. It may be the journalists and the publishers. And maybe
another press council.
Well, listen, if I write to the Vancouver Sun and complain about something they said about me, I can either take it to court, and maybe I'm a poor guy and can't afford court, or I'm at the mercy of that great publisher. Shouldn't I have a right to go to somebody and say, listen, those guys are dominant in this market and they did me a dirty deal. Did they or didn't they?
You have your remedy at law if you've got enough money to hire a good lawyer.
And that's the problem. That's why you need some kind of other redress.
So what you want is a voluntary press council.
That's where I'm thinking. But I remember I still got to get cabinet.
Wasn't there a thing in the original report, and I don't remember the strength of it, whereby publishers who would have separate contracts, which were reviewed by the government?
Not reviewed by the government, but reviewed by this thing called the Press Rights Panel. That was kind of vague in how to be set up. I got problems with that. I've got problems with it. I think Kent's intentions were good, but I haven't found a journalist or an editor who likes the idea, aside from the publishers.
That's not your biggest problem, Mr. Fleming.
Oh, I got lots of problems.
The biggest problem is that you're liberal, isn't it?
Oh, listen, go on. It's a tough problem out here, I'll tell you.
Fleming was active in organizing the Winnipeg Conference, the Invitation, a reform conference, reform-minded liberals, and you didn't invite Trudeau. Is that right?
I wasn't one of the organizers. I was involved.
Well, you're being semantic. Anyway, you had the gall to organize a conference, and you didn't invite the Prime Minister because you didn't dare ask him to come to Winnipeg.
That's not true. I didn't organize it, Jack. I'm sure if he came, people would have been delighted. But I think the idea was that a lot of people, guys like yourself, who look and they're supposed to confront and criticize the party in power, said, are we healthy or not healthy? There's a perception that one person's in control. Well, we're liberals. We have the right to have a meeting and talk about what the problems are, and that's what we did.
Tell me, did you sign that rebellion letter with Monique Bejan? You didn't?
I've been around politics too long. No, I didn't.
No, you didn't sign it. Because you know what he said. The story came out from caucus. If they do it again, they better be signing letters of resignation. Pretty tough, isn't he?
He can be tough. That's why he's a good leader.
More with Jim Fleming. We might even talk about multiculturalism. Think we should?
Sure.
After the break. As a matter of fact, Jimmy Fleming and I have known each other for many years, and we took part in a highly unsuccessful imitation of front page challenge for CFTO in Toronto. When was that, Jimmy?
Gee, 15 years ago.
What was it called?
Newsmakers Match.
It was a phony copy of Front Page
Yeah.
Challenge. We used to do 4 shows on a Sunday. Was it any good?
Well, the problem was, from time to time, as I remember, Jack, we forgot or couldn't figure out who the guests were. I mean, it'd even tell us where they worked and in what city, and we couldn't get the guests. So.
Well, you and I were never very strong on things like the director of the Stratford Festival.
Exactly.
How do you manage in the rarefied atmosphere of a Liberal cabinet?
I'm surviving.
Okay. Multiculturalism. How much money are we spending for Scotchmen to buy bagpipes or whatever the ethnic demands are? And why is it necessary at all?
About last fiscal year, about $8 million in what they call grants and contributions.
A lot of
And
bagpipes.
A lot of bagpipes, except we don't spend much on bagpipes if that's folk art and dance and costume. And that's pretty much got going. In the prairies are the major multicultural area in the big cities, Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto. What we do spend a lot of money on is getting people to integrate into society, to get to know each other, to have seminars on education. And
Oh,
make
that's
sure
why
that-
you're out here.
That's right. I'm going to have a seminar on race relations and the law on the 22nd to 24th of April. Vancouver's got some problems, you know that.
Will there be any real people at the seminar or just the same old
no,
faces?
it's going to be limited, so we don't have 500 people all laying out the same gripe. Top lawyers, Judge Jules Deschênes of the Quebec Superior Court's chairing it. We've got top people, Walter Tarnopolsky from the Human Rights Commission, but leaders in the various visible minority communities as well who are distinguished in academia and sociology and stuff like that. And we're going to go and have a hard look at the criminal law and say, you know, how much civil liberties do you allow to the point that people are harassed and beaten up and frightened? And is there a balance point? Can you change the law without taking away civil liberty? Or you can't, and you got to do the job on the education side. That's what it's all about.
All right, now, just to be provocative, the KKK, and that's where the media have been irresponsible, in any encouragement of going to burnings or whatnot for public relations with KKK, as I think, bad, and should not be done by any responsible media. The KKK are coming out here to move their headquarters to Vancouver. Best to be ignored altogether, I think.
It's not going to put a lot of pressure on office space availability in Vancouver.
No. But what do you do? Because the moment they appear, then you get the other idiots on the other end of the fridge.
Yeah, you get the Marxist-Leninists are going and so
And then
on.
you get bash, 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 because they want to create these confrontations, these people, don't they?
Yeah. Listen, later this morning I've got a news conference, and if I can take a second here, we've just done a Gallup poll last November, 2,000 Canadians plus, coast to coast. One question, I just got the preliminary stuff. I would support organizations that work toward preserving Canada for whites only. 31.3% of all Canadians, according to that Gallup, move from agree to agree completely with that concept. That means we've got a lot of fear and a lot of tension over the racial mix of Canada. So, you know, I think you're dead on. How do you deal with it? That's a big problem. The real way you deal with it is that they get to know each other, they get to respect each other. People who take advantage of their race, white, black, or whatever color, you aren't afraid to talk up and say, that's a lot of nonsense. But there are a whole lot of people, simply because you notice them on the street, because they're the minority, that you shoot at on hard economic
Back to the
times.
Gallup poll. You've got a minor breakdown there. Give me the question again.
I would support organizations that work toward preserving Canada for whites only. 31.3% either agree or agree completely. Agree completely, 15.4%. That's pretty shocking.
Fearsome.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking.
15% of all Canadians, if this poll is correct, say, let's work towards a totally white Canada.
Yeah.
And 31.3% agree or agree completely with that objective.
Yeah.
That's fearsome.
It's very frightening.
Why did you had the poll done because of your concerns?
Yeah, because people say there's no proof of that, there's no real conflict. It's silly to talk about having a Brixton here, you know, the British riots. We'll never have the problems like the southern U.S. And you know what, I don't want to cause more trouble, but I want to identify that there genuinely is a problem out there, and we got to do something about it.
Is there much pressure on you to curb immigration from the underprivileged countries?
I don't get that, but I'm the Minister of Multiculturalism. I support the idea that we're all fair and equal, and we got our obligations to fit into society. We have the right to be proud of what we are. But yeah, you hear it sometimes.
I mean, I think we overdo some aspects of it, and I'm not talking about immigrants, I'm talking about student visas. Simon Fraser University, what's the figure? 1,100 postgraduate students from outside Canada. And there are complaints about it, and concerns about it, and concerns about, one, how some of them get in, and how they pass these TOEFL examinations. On occasion, imposters are used to qualify. Are we being too generous in that aspect, when Canadians find it difficult to get places in universities?
I'm kind of messing beyond my pot of responsibilities, but yeah, I think there's a legitimate concern. You want people to come and they're going to go back and be influential. The idea is in their own country, especially from the third world, so they come here and learn about Canada and like Canada. That's fine. And Canadian taxpayers, largely across the country, put a whole lot of subsidy into that happening. A lot of those kids, in turn, want to stay here. And there's a question of that versus some poor person who waits and waits and waits out there going through the process properly.
Because once they get in on the visa,
it's a balance.
Once they get in, you can't get them out.
Yeah, you got to balance it and be fair so that the kids who've come here either themselves earlier, when they were youngsters, or first, second, fifth generation, they've got to have access to our system too reasonably.
Okay,
but
James.
the problem is some of those kids are very smart kids that come here.
Well, no doubt about it. They're the cream of the crop.
Yeah.
They're the ones who could afford to pay an economic rate for their education.
Well, we support some of them a lot too, and there's some scholarships.
Okay, James.
They work hard.
Jim Fleming, Minister of State, Multiculturalism, Kent Commission. Try and give him some sharp, intelligent phone calls right in his teeth after the break. Jim Fleming, Minister of State. It's quite funny. You give me that story, and we've got it accurately. 31.3% of Canadians agree or agree completely with the concept. Now, I'll change the phrase and make it sound racist. Of an all-white Canada. Is that right?
That's not what it says.
What does it say?
It says, I would support organizations that work toward preserving Canada for whites only. There's a nuance. Do you do shorthand?
Yeah. I would support organizations that would work towards preserving Canada for whites only. Well, now, you can't argue with my interpretation. 3 out of 10 Canadians want an all-white Canada. Is that correct?
That's what it says.
Is that an accurate interpretation?
Yep.
It's quite fearsome when you put it that way, isn't it? Go ahead to Jim Fleming.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Fleming.
Good morning.
I'm wondering if you can name me a country where you can bring in, where they have brought in people of various races, various colors, and they've gotten along. Now, why does Canada continue to go against what has already happened elsewhere? If you've been to England, if you've been to the States, various other countries. I think why you get a lot of people saying that they're in favor of a white policy in immigration is that they're partly because of the uncertainty of the wishy-washy change every other day the policy of immigration. There is no policy for immigration. The only policy there is one of expediency. Whichever group screams the loudest causes the much uproar, and also we have so few politicians that get in there for one election and say to the electorate, all right, you put me in here, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think and what I feel should be done for this country. Privately, they'll tell you that they agree with you, because I've confronted politicians privately, one-on-one, and they've agreed that these racial things are going to be a real problem, and they're beginning to be a problem now.
Right.
Publicly, they will not say a bloody word because they're worried about their index pension, getting reelected, getting backlashes and everything else. Now, I want you people to stop playing games and listen to the majority in this country.
Okay.
Well, listen, you, sir, have the right to run for office. You have the right to express your views. And so far, nobody who has your views has been elected recently in this country. And all parties support what has to be a sensible and practical policy, that you don't base immigration on race, and that racial prejudice is based on ignorance and fear of somebody who's different. This country is built on waves of immigration, whether it's Ukrainians or Japanese or Chinese or Brits or Scots or French or whatever. We're a conglomerate of over the years of waves of immigration of different people from different areas where they wanted to escape to something better. And if we don't support that principle, then the country will blow itself apart.
No.
Okay, fair enough. There's another aspect I want to bring in. Racial tensions become greater, I suspect, when the economy is on a downturn, right?
Yes, very much. When you have economic hardship, you want to blame somebody. How come I don't have a job? Gosh, I went into that store and that guy's a different color and he's got a job.
Yeah, but he's working for $3 an hour.
That's right.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, that gentleman was quite true in what he stated. Basically, the immigration policy of this country should be done by the people on a referendum basis across the country, not by politicians trying to get reelected. I'll make 3 very sharp, succinct points. Number 1, immigration, the racism starts at the immigration office in Ottawa. People have very little control of what comes in the country. There's not a country in the world where multiracial societies do exist, coexist in a great admiration for each other, because basically people are tribal.
Next point.
Canada is being populated by Europeans, 99% off. That's where where the white factor comes in. Basically, as far as the rest of the world, very small portions off. Point two. We have a problem in Simon Fraser University.
Well,
where we have somewhere in the vicinity of between 1,200.
No, I dealt with that.
Yeah, but the thing about this, Jack, is this: that it costs $5,000 per student to go through school. They pay the same rate as the Canadian does, and so therefore we're subsidizing that by about $5 million of my tax dollars.
We've done that one. But what about, I'm surprised, or rather I'm not really surprised, but we don't normally get into this area because I'm so sensitive about it.
I know you are.
I don't want to become a Doug Collins or any of that caper, although I realize the concerns and incidents happen to make your hair stand on end, and you back off them because you don't want to be accused of whipping up what other people might interpret as racism. This is a great and pressing problem.
It's a big problem, but fundamentally, how can you simply say because somebody's a different color, they're bad?
Well, just a moment, sir. What do you think about the immigration policy of Japan? Do you think it's racist?
Well, Japan, if you visited there, is not a country like Canada with 24 million people and the second largest geographic size. We survive on immigration building the economy of this country. That's the basis of it over the years. We've been positive on. Give me a minute now. We've been positive. We've been positive on refugee problems and so on, but basically the immigration to Canada has been family reunification, plus people coming here and the population growing, wanting to build houses, wanting to buy fridges and washing machines. That's been a part of our strength as a country.
Okay, I'm much obliged for your call. Go ahead, please.
Am I on?
Yes.
Mr. Webster, Mr. Fleming, I think that we should consider this, the very fact that we've had an open immigration policy, far more open than any other Western country, and I think we should take an example from Australia, and in that I don't think we should be talking about white, black, yellow, or brown skins. I think we should take a look at ourselves and the amount of people that we can support in this country, and the politicians who have an open immigration policy, they simply want to bring in people so that those new people will vote for them.
Okay.
But sir, you know, we have an open immigration policy in the sense there's no discrimination on the basis of race, religion, that kind of thing. But there are limits. You have a limit each year. You project the needs, the unemployment levels of your society, and you put those limits in place. So we do control at the gate how many people come in. That's why sometimes you hear complaints from constituents. My mother can't get in, or my sister, or whatever, although they meet the qualification. So there are controls on numbers according to Canadian society. And
one of the other factors you must consider now in today's climate is BC, we have a budget, a health budget of $2 billion. That was $6 billion budget. We are now going to be, whether we like it or not, and the federal government policies, you heard Trudeau, he's fed up giving the money to the provinces. We're going to face cutbacks on all of our social services in BC this year, health, education, and more unemployment. Perhaps it is a time to review numbers again.
Yeah, but you do. When you have hard times, Jack, then you do cut back in the following year on the numbers. Remember, there's a process delay, and that's one of our problems. How do you predict now what economics will be in 18 months, but now you've got to go through the process of arranging who can come and can't come. But as far as working and earning their pay, you know, it's a myth to say that immigrants come here and are on the dole. That's not true. There's a higher level of employment and hard work at lower pay from new Canadian groups than there is from established society.
Well, nice to know you can still talk anyway, Jimmy. Jim Fleming, Minister of State. When is this race conference?
April 22nd to 24th at the Four Seasons, I believe.
Oh, nothing but the best for the federal government facilities. Four Seasons. Why couldn't you have rented a church hall?
Because I heard you had an interest in the church hall, and you're making enough money now.
My thanks to Jim Fleming. Next, Jack Munro, President of the IWA. After the break. I was talking about the fucking
Yeah,
CDC.
yeah, terrible.
Hi, Rick.
Geez, I didn't bring my ashtray, Chief.
Well, here's
Sorry.
one, John.
And Stanley is going to have to go live in the community.
Everyone in British Columbia is very concerned about the future of the forest products industry and the rest of our economy, and Bennett's promise for wage controls in the public sector. Jack Munro yesterday was present at a meeting with the steering committee of the heavyweights of the forest products industry in British Columbia, steering committee of the FIR. Mr. Munro, could you tell me what they said to you and what you said to them so we get a feeling of what's going to happen on June 13th and thereafter?
Well, nothing unusual is going to happen on June the 15th, Jack. We're going to get our wage increase that we negotiated last year after a 6-week strike.
13%?
13%. The problem that I think the industry and their philosophy right now is that they're reacting the way Americans react, and Americans are always one extreme or the other extreme. They're either real bullish or real bearish, whatever, but I think overreact all the time. The industry yesterday told us all of the doom and gloom things that they see happening to the market. It's going to get worse. Companies, not just small companies, but some are not going to survive if the housing situation stays the way it is. We disagree with that. There are different indicators. We use different ones. The three major associations in the United States that provide mortgage money for people to be able to buy homes supported Reagan's politics a year and a half ago and lobbied for him. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to get him elected, sat quietly in the wings for the last year or so. But in the last 2 weeks, they have turned around. Last week, they were in Ottawa. Three of them in particular, three of these associations, the majors, going to Reagan and say, look, your policies are not working. You have to get off of this kick that you're on. You have to put money in the housing industry. And they have asked for between $9 and $12 billion to be put in between 90 and 120 days from when they met, which was, I think, last week or possibly.
So what you're telling me is
before.
That you're hoping that there's sufficient pressure on Reagan from the house builders and lumber builders and mortgage lenders in the United States that he will change his policy and rescue British Columbia.
Well, rescue his own country. First of all, we're a spin-off and certainly would benefit from increased housing starts in the United States. 70% of our wood from BC goes into the United States as far as for home building is concerned. And as I say, these three large associations have said they want between $9 and $12 billion. They want it within between 90 and 100 days. And if they don't, then they are going to switch their political slush fund against Reagan. And plus the fact that a lot of Republicans, his own party, have got a heck of a lot of pressure on Reagan right now.
Can you tell me how much lumber consumption or forest products consumption is down in Canada or in BC at the moment?
Well, in BC, 2 weeks ago, we were 31% laid off, about 18,000 people. Because loggers have been off so long, there is becoming a mix in the logs that are now available. This week, we are in the best shape that we've been in since December. We are, I think, looking at about 12,000 people out of work, about 24%.
In other words, about 7% of your people are going back to work?
This week, yes.
On logging?
Mostly logging, Jack.
Mostly logging. So you're going down from 18,000 unemployed to 12,000 unemployed?
This week, yes.
That's because there just isn't enough logs in the water
of the right mix.
Of the right mix to do the right thing.
Right.
But you know perfectly well that the doom and gloom they seem to talk about is real. Mac and Blow lost 26 million, down 123%, right?
Right.
BC Forest Products made 17 million, but they're way down. What about Doman and Wannock and Crestwood and Weldwood? Everybody's in bad shape.
Well, they're right, and the reason they're in bad shape is because of high interest policies in Canada and the United States. Because Doman, for example, is in trouble because I think of the interest load that he's packing when he bought 1/3 of Old Rainier of Canada. BC Forest Products have got problems. They were overextended.
Wannock,
I think, for the first time has been losing some money. I'm sure they're not accustomed to doing that.
did you say to me that you expect some of the bigger boys to close down this summer?
Well, what the industry told us yesterday, that it wasn't just fly-by-nighters that were in trouble. There were some good-sized outfits in serious trouble. Probably more serious trouble if banks knew what the hell to do with a sawmill, but banks don't want sawmills.
Didn't you feel tempted under this pressure yesterday to say, look, we're due 13% on June the 15th. Would it help if we held back our 13%?
The thought did not cross my mind at all, Jackson. The wages are not the problem. The problem is the market is soft. I think the industry is doing a disservice to a lot of its employees and our members by overemphasizing the doom and gloom. Sure, things are tough. People are losing money. Mac and Blow lost more than the rest, but Mac and Blow, when everybody's making money, makes less than the rest. They have been inefficient as hell. They overloaded that cement tree they got downtown full of people. They're far too many people working. The Somas is shut down for 5 weeks. Big Mill, or whatever it is, 3 weeks or 5 weeks. I think on Tuesday we had maintenance people working. We had 76 maintenance people working, and there were 85 foremen wandering around the joint. It doesn't make sense.
Which mill?
Somas, McMillan Bloedel in Port Alberni.
You had 76 maintenance people and they had 85 foremen?
Yes.
Are you suggesting that they're keeping on the foreman unnecessarily while they're laying off your men?
Well, I'm saying, Jack, that, and I'm not saying because we hurt, everybody has to hurt. I'm saying that if they had any seriousness or compassion, they would stop this nonsense forever about talking about wage deferments and do some sensible things.
Refresh my memory. Did you cut your union's wages just now? Was there something about that?
I had to ask some of our people to take a layoff.
That was it. You laid off some union business agents.
Well, regional staff people, support people.
That's pretty tough for you to have to do.
Well, that's right. Our revenue has been down, or was down, for 30% for quite a while, and we rely on dues that are being paid. But we're surviving. We're sharing the misery. And
next, we'll ask Jack Munro of the IWA what he thinks about the Bennett Plan. Wage controls of 10% in the public sector after the break. Plan with Jack Munro. Let me ask you, first of all, are the employers, did they make any sounds about you taking out any restrictive practices in your contract?
No, they didn't, Jack. We, I think, agreed on the agenda before the meeting, and this nonsense about reducing the agreement or wage deferment was kind of a spur-of-the-moment thing. They didn't think it out. We should have had the meeting that we had yesterday on February the 17th without all the rest of this falderall and talk about economics, what we did yesterday.
But you could be a big help to the forest industry if you said, okay, you can have a 7-day week. That would cut costs incredibly. And don't you already have the 7-day week where pulp mills and and other operations are side by side?
We do not have, we're not connected with pulp mills, Jack, and we do not have any 7-day operations.
Somebody has.
Well, both pulp unions certainly have 7-day operations. The problem, Jack, is not wages. We've got people who work 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off. Their wages are reduced by 50%. Those mills are not selling any more wood.
Isn't that a good share the work idea, though, to switch the staffs that are available to prevent suffering of individual IWA members?
No, and mills that are doing that are not sharing the work. The mill operates for 2 weeks and then it's down for 2 weeks.
Oh, it's not sharing the work.
No.
2 weeks on and 2 weeks off.
Yeah, the mill is down for 2 weeks. We have all kinds of mills, particularly in the interior, that are working, and have been for several months, working 4 days on and then 3 days off.
But you know, I know one lumber guy, no names, no pipe drill, who says if he can get a 7-day week, he could put a lot of people back to work.
Well, that character is obsessed with that, and he's been fooling around with this for, I don't know, 4 years, I guess, trying to get us to agree to a 7-day work week. When he built the new mill, he started it on a 7-day operation basis before we were organized, before we were certified, and before we negotiated an agreement. That mill, because it isn't built for 7 days, and mills take a lot of maintenance. After a few months, he had to lay off about 50% of his crew for 6 weeks or something because there was too much wood. They couldn't handle it.
What you're telling me is a 7-day week in an IWA operation doesn't cut the boss's costs enough to...
No.
That's your point. Okay. Now...
And people are entitled to have Saturday and Sunday off. What the hell? We don't want to get completely like the United States.
Bennett's 10% plan. That's his promise. He's going to introduce legislation. Is that not a good thing at a time when public expenditures for people with secure, comfortable jobs? Don't you think that Bennett was reasonable when he said the public sector 8, 10, 12% plus 2% productivity?
Well, Jack, I'm not going to comment on the percentages because nobody, including Bennett or his helpers, knows what the hell he's talking about when he's talking about the percentages. Is it 10% or is it 12% or is it 14%? If it is 14% on total compensation, that's one thing. If it's 10% or 8% on total compensation, that's something different. I have not commented really on that whole nonsensical thing that he had that night. First of all, we think the employers knew what was coming, and I think that that's a disaster. I think that every country that has tried, United States, Canada, Australia, all of these so-called free countries that have tried wage controls have found out they don't work. Canadian workers from 75 to 78 basically stayed within the guidelines, a lot lower guidelines than what Bennett is talking about, and it didn't work. The inflation kept going, prices kept going up, profits kept going up. So if it doesn't work for a whole country, and never has in any country, how the hell can it work for one segment of people in one particular area?
Because he's out of money. He doesn't want to go above his 12%. He's trying to put the brakes on public spending.
Well, Jack, I guess the government is suffering because of the downturn in the forest industry, but when you're in a downturn, then you got to get some things going. What is a government employee going to do? This nonsensical slogan they got, we get the spirit, or I got the spirit, or something. If they settle for less than anybody else, is he going to give them a little card that says, I got the spirit, and when you go into Safeway, get 20% off your groceries, or reduce mortgage rates, or reduce apartment rates?
Or I got the spirit watered down?
Yeah, get the spirit to get rid of them.
But the point that say that again?
I say what we need is the spirit to get rid of them.
Why don't you say to hell with Bennett, like your leader, Kinnaird, said?
No, that's Jim's line. I can make up my line.
You can make up your own line.
The people, Jack, that are remembered in this world for doing things when economies are down we're progressive people like Roosevelt, and let's get the country moving, build dams, build railroads, build roads. That's the people that
that's the kind of leadership we need now.
Right.
But just one more point to this, and I'll stop nagging you on it. You in the IWA, every member of the IWA is under the free market economic squeeze, right?
Right.
And if McEnblow or anybody else wants to go broke, you can't stop them, right?
Right.
You depend on your productivity.
Right.
Is it not fair that when you are in downtown that the taxpayer should not be asked to supply major wage increases for secure public servants?
Well, Jack, I don't accept the fact that public service negotiators or something are going to fly off in some tangent and do something ridiculous. They haven't even started negotiations yet. The last time they negotiated a 3-year agreement, which the public sector haven't been doing for a long time. They got 8%, 8%, and 8% in 3 years, far less than what the rate of inflation has been. The politicians, Bennett, has contributed a hell of a lot more to inflation through their wages than public service people. Public service people are having to reduce their standard of living.
But it's nice to see the senior guys frozen, isn't it? Even if the top guys in BC Hydro slipped away from it by getting the 13% the week before.
I know. Jack, the whole damn thing is so phony, and it's a charade. They don't care about people. What the hell? If they cared about people who have been out of work, we have people that worked 4 months last year, and that's all. What happens to their insurance rates? You know, they go up 25%. The water rates, the hydro rates, this nonsense we went through for 2 or 3 years that we're on the verge of an oil shortage in Canada or in the world, and so we got to go to world prices. Everything is hammering at working people. You can't afford to buy a house. You can't afford to stay in your apartment. You're eating less. All of this garbage. Now, all of a sudden, we discover we got a glut of oil in the world. We don't know what the hell to do with it all. They psych us up and stick it to us and then back off, and that's the way it works.
How long is it going to be bad for your economy in the forest industry?
We say the second quarter is going to be a lot better.
You say the second quarter of 1982?
82.
82.
Right.
And what do the big boys from the big companies say yesterday?
Oh, well, some character in Wall Street, wherever the hell Wall Street is, New York or something, was crying the other day, so it psyched these guys up. They don't think it's going to get better until the last quarter or possibly even into 83.
The forest industry are professional mourners hedging their bets by trying to frighten you half to death.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Calls to Jack Munro of the IWA after the break. Didn't even mention your 13% increase in June the 15th in St. Luke. We could employ more people.
They didn't mention it, Jack, because that's not the problem, and they know it.
Go ahead to Jack Munro.
Yes, Jack. I'd like to speak to you about getting more people back to work in your industry there. Why don't you take a 20% cut and put in your contract clause that when times get better, you get retroactive pay from the time you go back to work?
Out of future profits.
That's right.
Well, working people and IWA members, along with everybody else, are having a hard enough time meeting our daily expenses right now. We've got people whose mortgage is doubled, for goodness sake, since they renewed them last time, especially since last August. People who have nothing left over their paychecks and the wages, once again, are not the problem. The problem is the market is soft, compounded by ridiculously high interest rates in Canada.
No, you say, in a loud voice.
No.
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 No goddamn way.
You say no. So you're going to keep a lot of people unemployed by your arrogance. Why don't you take the example up in 100 Mile House where workers took a 10%.
Yeah, what's happening? Do you know what's happening to that mill?
Working, and yet
okay, I've got the message.
The community took a 10%. The businesses in the community took a 10%. That's the only place in BC that I know where I can get a 15-cent cup of coffee.
Did the banks lower their interest rates?
Do you know what's happening up in that 100 Mile? It was
sure,
a Christian Labour Association voluntarily took a cut. Was it a real union?
No, it's not a real union. That one is an offshoot. The one that he's talking about is a company association at Ainsworth Lumber, and that mill is not selling any more wood. It doesn't matter what the wages are, you can't sell wood. That's the problem.
You're Clolet. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. Just to Mr. Munro, just a couple of points and then I'll get off the line. First of all, the government is the one who's at fault here for increasing the amount of lumber that was being cut during the good times when we were at high productivity and a high selling market. And now that we've reached levels that have gone down to a normal level, they're in trouble. Also, the companies have relied so much on the American market, it's not funny that all this problem has happened. Also, I was off for 4.5 months last year, and regarding the M&B taking a slash of 10% in the salaried people's income here, if I can get a guaranteed wage and a guaranteed amount of hours to work, I wouldn't mind going for the money they get also. And 2 weeks ago on a Monday, Mr. Waterland was on the news hour and made the statement that the British Columbia logging industry should start taking a look at wage rollbacks like the auto workers did in the States due to help prevent layoffs. We've drafted a letter up from Ucluelet here to send down to Mr. Waterland and telling him that it's actually the business of the union and the companies, and we wish that the Minister of Forest would not get involved in something, because by doing what he has done, he's given the industry the right to make restrictive clauses in the contract for 81 and 82.
Okay, Jack, that sounds like a good member of yours.
Yeah, it is, and really some good points. We have attempted to negotiate in negotiations a guaranteed annual wage for particularly loggers if he lives in Ucluelet, whose year is getting shorter and shorter and shorter because the trees are getting further up the mountain. A couple of other good points. When they were talking publicly about wage deferral, they didn't exclude mills that have been working for the Japanese market exclusively. SIPA hasn't lost a day. They have been cutting strictly for the Japanese market. Companies that rely on the Japanese market, the European market, are better off than companies, and we've said it for years, that some companies should not rely wholly 100% on the United States market. They should develop alternative markets. I appreciate his point on Waterland. I assume Waterland, as the key minister as far as forests are concerned, was speaking for the government, who immediately, without knowing what the hell he's talking about, jumped on the bandwagon of the industry saying, yeah, that's a good idea, kick the workers while they're down, kick them some more. And I hope every IWA member understands that was the position of the cabinet.
Good enough. Don't you feel sorry for Calvert Knudsen, who's cutting his $400,000 salary by 15%?
Jack, that's a deferral for 4 months. They have deferred the review of salaries. I'm sure at a quarter of that much money, a hell of a lot of IWA people would be quite prepared to knock off 15% for 4 months.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack.
Good morning.
I'd just like to say that I always understood a union was supposed to stick together. Here, this union is so worried about individual. I've got more seniority. I want my increase. To hell with my fellow member.
I don't understand that.
I don't understand.
The point is not clear. Try again.
No, okay. You've got these guys with seniority. Now they're willing to let the lower guys go so that these guys with higher seniority can get a wage increase. Why don't they just settle for not taking an increase, a retroactive like the fellow member said, and doing it that way?
I guess you have to keep on. I guess you have to keep on saying it and saying it and saying it and saying it. Wages are not the problem in the forest industry. There is absolutely nothing similar about the forest industry and what UAW did in the United States. What the UAW did in the United States was to defer some things and the savings to be passed on to the consumer. Hopefully more consumers would buy more cars and put more UAW people back to work.
Your problem in the
My problem is they can't sell wood.
In other words, there's no market.
Doesn't matter what it costs, you can't sell it.
If you took a 50% cut, they still couldn't sell the lumber.
That's right, because people can't afford to borrow money to buy houses, to build houses.
Are you telling me there are stocks of unsold lumber in BC now?
Yes, there is quite a bit, Jack, but not as much as if the interest rates in Canada weren't so high. I believe some employers would do more stockpiling because it wouldn't cost them so much. But they can't afford to stockpile now.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning. It doesn't take a mathematical genius to understand that a high inflation or high
interest
mortgage rate and interest rate imposed by the Bank of Canada is inflationary in itself.
Right.
For example, if an industry has to borrow money at a preferred rate of 18% or 16%?
18.
If it can't afford to expand and it can't afford to hire more employees, or it can't afford to continue its operation as it is, therefore it has to lay off employees, these people then go on the dole, and that's inflationary in itself. I mean, there should be some type of leadership, as Mr. Munro said earlier in the program, to get this economy going. Not a mega project here and a mega project there, but projects all over British Columbia.
I agree with you, caller.
Okay, Boy, go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack?
Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Munro, stick to your guns. Because, my God, you know, you talk about the IWA in the States. They borrowed $450 million from the United States government, and then they got their people back to work, and all those people are getting a relief.
What people? Who borrowed $450 million?
Chrysler Corporation.
Oh, Chrysler, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then they bring the people back to work at a reduced wage, and those guys are on relief.
I agree with you. The champions of the free enterprise system sure as hell discover the socialist system when they're in trouble.
That's a good line. Yeah, go ahead, please. Hello.
Hello?
That's you, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. Premier Bennett is advocating a tightening of the belt.
Our belts are so short now we can't tighten them anymore.
Go on.
I think a good start would be made in tightening our belts around the necks of Jerome, Munro, and Kinnaird.
Well, the belts aren't that long either. So.
That's hardly a fair comment. More with Jack Munro after the break. Jack Munro, president of the IWA. Go ahead from Mission, BC. Hello, Mission. Where's Mission? Mission's gone. Go ahead, please. What's the matter here?
Hello.
That's you. Speak up.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to make a comment and ask Jack a quick question. As far as the current situation, I don't blame him for not wanting to even discuss the possibility of a combined wage decrease or something, because quite simply, until the interest rate situation in the United States changes, absolutely nothing is going to change in British Columbia. It would be, at best, a short-term solution to putting some men back to work, and I don't think it would last more than 3 or 4 months. What I'd really like to get from Mr. Munro was the answer to the question you asked earlier. And it seems that most labor leaders are unable to come to grips with the question of, is not the certainty of a civil service job in these current times at least some compensation for the fact that they are going to have a raise which apparently is going to be controlled. There have to be a lot of private sector workers who are out of work that would surely be happy with a job today at the rate that they were earning last year, as opposed to no job at all. And I'd really like a specific answer to that question from Mr. Munro.
Well, I don't mind answering it. I think that certainly a lot better now that the civil servants have the right to free collective bargaining with the right to withhold their labors that they haven't not had for very long in British Columbia. The NDP brought that into being. I'm sure you remember that when old W.A.C. Bennett was calling the shots in BC, I believe it was New Year's Day, he would make this speech and he would announce that they're going to get 2% or 3%, and that was the end of it. They had no bargaining rights. They were less free than the rest of us. Since that time, the BCGEU and other groups, I think, have been quite responsible. They're not on strike every year. They negotiate. They come to an agreement, and I don't know what it's going to take to satisfy them this year, but I don't think we should start condemning them before they even get to the bargaining table.
Yeah, you won't face up to the basic fact that any provincial government is up against it right now. Trudeau's going to cut, how many billion out of grants. Health care is squeezed. Everything is going to be in a terrible squeeze. And if there's a salary increase, there's going to be more unemployed.
Well, Jack, what are they doing about mortgage rates? Or why do we pay $1.60 for a turkey in Canada when you can get them for 46 cents in Blaine, you know? How about giving workers a break instead of dumping on workers all the time?
Because we've got socialist-type marketing boards that control everything.
Yeah,
you know that.
Right. And we should get rid of them.
We should get rid of the marketing boards. There's no free enterprise in that. You're in a free enterprise business.
Yes, I understand that.
And your guys, when the mill goes down, they're gone. And they ain't got no index pensions.
I understand that. And
don't you feel jealousy and envy for the civil servant who in British Columbia has got the best rates, 35-hour weeks in many cases, of anywhere in the country?
Well, Jack,
I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just trying to get you to tell me.
Well, Jack, I don't think that that civil servants, because there is some tenure there, should be expected to continue to take less like they did for years and years and years.
Fair enough. Mission. Go ahead from Mission.
Hello.
That's you, Mission.
Yes, I'm currently unemployed. I haven't worked since December the 23rd.
Yes.
Yeah, what do you do?
And I work in a shake mill.
Shake man, okay.
I have a bitch with Munro.
What's your bitch with Munro?
My bitch is that he's always saying that these guys don't make any money. We can't afford to buy houses. I work in an operation where there's 70 guys. And out of those 70 people, I'd say about 10 of them over there are renters. And the rest of these guys own their own homes. I own my own home myself. And everybody knows that the industry is in bad shape nowadays, and I would welcome a wage deferral if I knew I was going to get it. And also, I'd like to say, I blame Munro for this strike that we had here last summer. We were on strike for 8 bloody weeks.
6?
We were offered 14%. Offered 14%, and he said he kept us on strike for 8 bloody weeks to get 1% more, this guy here. And I got another thing to say, then I'll hang up. Don't ever get the impression that all IWA members are members of the NDP, because we're not. And it's philosophies like Munro and Kernard's that I and others like us despise. And keep it up, Munro. You'll drive the Socreds in there better than what you're doing now. Thanks.
You're welcome. It's no problem. Jack, the shingle industry is really an up and down industry. When the shingle industry is working, our people make, generally speaking, pretty fair money, 140, 150 bucks a day. And certainly living out in the valley, most people own their own homes. As far as the strike is concerned, I've been on this program, on other programs. The reason that we had a strike was, and I've said many times, not strictly over wages. The wood product side of our industry wouldn't negotiate with the IWA. They were fooling around with pulp unions and wouldn't talk to us about what IWA problems were. When they fined us, we told them it was a mistake. They shouldn't fine us. They gave us less than they gave pulp unions. It wasn't 14%, and besides, the strike was only 6 weeks old.
Was the strike worth it?
Well, Jack, I guess no strike has very many pleasant memories about it. Unfortunately, it was necessary because of this attitude of the employers, and we told them that before we went on strike, during the strike, and since the strike. If they would have sat down and negotiated with us the way they should have, we could have possibly avoided the strike.
Anyway, there is a possibility that Bennett can create a confrontation, put you and Kinnaird and the BCGEU on the other side, and go for a straight confrontation vote in the fall and get re-elected on an anti-labor kick?
Well, Jack, we're not Einsteins, but we aren't exactly Mortimer Snurds either. We're not walking down this road into a confrontation to get the bandit re-elected, in spite of my friend from Mission. Next caller.
No. In spite of your information, you're still a staunch NDPer.
Certainly I am.
That's what I wanted to get from you. I like little labels on people.
There is no question. I am an NDPer, and any working person who thinks and looks at the records of these so-called free enterprisers, if he thinks for himself, would also be an NDPer.
No, it's saying IWA man could possibly be a social creditor?
Right.
Or a liberal.
Or a liberal.
Or
a liberal.
Hey?
What's the liberal? They're extinct out here.
My thanks to Jack Munro, president of the IWA. It's going to be a cool, low profile as the summer goes ahead. And he says this morning 6,000 loggers have gone back to work.
Right.
I'll be back to wrap up the program after the break. I've got two biggies on Monday morning. One of them is a fellow whose name I forget. I think he leads the NDP. What's his name? What is it?
Possibly Broadbent.
Oh, is that his first? No, Ed Broadbent. Possibly Broadbent. Ed Broadbent, 9 a.m., and the man in charge of the National Parole Board, he's got some things to answer for, Bill Outerbridge. Monday at 9 a.m. precisely.